Welcome everyone to Through the Void Gate, a Warcaster podcast for new and experienced players. Deploying in 3.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 7 of Through the Void Gate. I'm joined today by Justin.
Howdy.
And Spencer.
Hi, everybody.
Oh, God. Let's not do that too much. So let's kick off the podcast. We got some news today. There has been an errata of the 2 gate launchers in the game to bring them in line with the ISA cipher card that allows you to launch a gate. So both the Nyx and the Gate Crasher are now capped at 3 arc when they deploy their gate, instead of the 5 they originally had. That kind of streamlines all gate launching things and probably what you can look forward to going into the future with any other gate launching cards or weaponry. And the backer kit is out. If you haven't already, check your email. You should have an email asking you to fill out the backer kit so we can get all our new shinies. Do we have any other news?
I think that covers it.
All right. Well, I'll turn it over to you, Spencer, for what's going on in the community.
All right, so this week's community updates, looks like Charge and Spike came out with their Pendulum episode. So if you want their take on Pendulum, the tournament packet, you can go check them out. The Hyper News Network also came out with a podcast on terrain this week. So it's definitely an interesting listen. You should go check it out. Studio M has also been releasing some recordings of his TTS matches from the league on his YouTube channel. War Budgies has come out with episode 2 of his Battle Box narrative series. This one, ISA versus the AC. And finally, for ourselves at throughthevoidgate.com, the faction articles have all been updated. And Justin has written a nice Pendulum article going a little bit more in depth into that if that's something that you wanted to read. And now we'll get on to our main topic for this episode, which is scenarios. And Dino's going to lead us off.
Okay, so we're talking scenarios today. The core book has 9 scenarios, 3 skirmish, 6 full size. The point of scenario is to make sure that you don't just have 2 armies being a gun line against each other in a game. It's to give focal point and reason to come to the battle, and it's a very important part of any tabletop war game, in my opinion. If weak scenarios make for a weak game usually, and so having these focal points that you can fight over and that are contested and make these highlight points in the game, it's really the function of scenario. It adds interest to the game and makes it a much less stale environment for all the players. Warcaster is an objective-based game. And by that, I mean that Warcaster, you can attrition to an extent on your opponent, but you can't attrition them out of a game. So there's no, your win conditions are objective-based entirely, besides secondaries. But we'll get into that later. So because the focus of the game is so heavy on objectives, scenarios are vitally important to the game and forming a game plan for your games. So then we have the 2 different sides of games, and there's a lot of differences between them, which normally, when you look at them from the bird's eye view, you have the skirmish scenarios, which are a 30 by 30 map, 3 turn pulse rounds, and that's usually 3 objective markers, but there is one with 5. As opposed to full size, where it's a 48 by 48 mat, it's 3 pulse rounds, but they're 5 turns each, and they tend to have more objective markers. That's the bird's eye. But then when you start digging into them, they are vastly different, and they play very different on the table. So we'll be jumping into each of the scenarios, how you score different things in the game, and even secondaries, just to kind of give everybody like a big taste of what scenario is all about in Warcaster.
And the main difference between skirmish and full size is just the board size. And then also that full size tends to have differential scoring, which means certain units can score certain things and certain units score other things. Whereas skirmish, so far, except for one scenario, all units score everything. And those are 2 very minor differences from the bird's eye view, like Dino was just talking about, but they have a huge impact on how the game is actually played.
Like to the point where the game feels like a completely different game. between skirmish and full size, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, and the different increased round count also has a huge impact as well.
Oh, it
Right,
changes
'cause-
the way you activate things entirely.
Mhm.
That, and you'll be seeing different cards in your cipher deck multiple times in a pulse round. So, pitching a certain card is not as heartbreaking as it would be in skirmish when you're only likely to see it one time in a pulse round. So there's a lot of nitty gritty that happens with these seemingly minor changes.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how the scenarios in general are scored. Sneaky, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so I'll jump onto that. For the scoring, there's basically two different types of scoring in the game with the different scenarios. Oh, technically three. So the first one that you're going to run into most often is end of pulse round scoring. So the way that this works is that at the end of the pulse round, after the second player has taken their turn and you have resolved all of your continuous effects, got rid of your ciphers, removed your activation tokens, then the victory points are going to be scored. So this is really impactful in how the way the game is played, just because you basically have to set yourself up for that final turn. And that final turn is the one that really matters.
Right.
Now, what we found is that because of the way that works and the way that objectives are contested and scored in the game, that this gives the second player a huge advantage because they're the last person to determine what happens and who scores and how they score within a particular pulse round. This is particularly present on skirmish maps because they are smaller. Your units can reach across different objectives much easier. You can move more units onto different points easier. So it just means that last activation, you have a lot more presence across the entire board, being able to affect multiple objectives. It is less so on full size, but it is still a distinct advantage. Now, the second type is end of activation scoring. So the way that this works is that when a model activates, if at the end of their activation, there is no other models contesting the zone no other enemy models contesting the zone that they are on, they score it. So that's pretty relevant because it has to be at their end of their activation. So it makes things like your second cipher card and continuous effects at the end of the pulse round less impactful than on end of pulse round scoring. And then in certain scenarios, like we'll talk about later, where you're limited to what models can score, it can also severely limit your play based on which units can score, because you're pretty much only going to be activating those units so that you can score them. So they definitely both have pros and cons. We prefer end of activation scoring here in general, just because we found that it creates a more balanced and engaging experience, just because of how brutal the second turn advantage can be at times in end of pulse round scoring. Now, there is one particular map that scores in a very interesting way, because instead of scoring with normal objective markers like in the rest of the game, it uses zones. So we'll talk about that in a second because it's the first full-size map available in the core rulebooks, but it's worth noting that one does score a little bit differently than the rest in the game. And also that there is another type of objective, which are portable objectives. And this is something that can create a very different experience depending on how where the portables are placed, who can pick them up, how it's scored, whether it's, something holding a portable objective is securing a zone at the end, they score extra points. Or if it's a warjacker vehicle has to bring this objective somewhere and drop it off, and as soon as it gets dropped off, it gets scored. So it's definitely an interesting flex point that PP is put into the game in order to give them more options as far as how scenarios are designed.
I can't wait for them to really flex on using portable objectives in the future, because currently I think there's only 2 scenarios that use portables at all.
Correct. One in the base rules and one in the first contact.
And I think the first contact one is interesting, especially now there's been a little bit of clarification on how that scenario actually works.
Yes.
The one in the core rulebook I'm not a huge fan of, because it kind of feels like you just pull those portables back, and we'll talk about that later on. But they just kind of become these stagnant things later on, and I think that they offer a huge toolbox of things that Privateer can do with them, just having the rules there. But I think right now they're not really using them to their full value.
Yeah, they definitely have a lot of options that they can go with that. So we'll see what they come up with in the future.
I really hope they do come up with some really fun and interesting ways to use portable objectives, because I think they're potentially one of the more interesting things that could be added to the game without adding extra rules.
Do we know how many scenarios we're getting in Collision Course?
I believe it's going to equal what we got in the base rule set, but I could be wrong.
I've heard 3 rumored skirmish scenarios. I don't know of anything else. I haven't heard any rumors about anything else.
That's going to be interesting. Like, there's so many options with the scenarios in the game. You could essentially play a string of how many games and not see the same game twice, especially with, like, the randomly disappearing scenarios. They could shake out how many different ways every time.
Right.
It'll be interesting to see, for the tournament format, are there set scenarios for each one?
So for the tournament format, it's basically going to be a collection of the scenarios that are released. So based off of the Hungerford interview, they're supposedly going to have a more or less curated list of scenarios pulled from the pool of available scenarios.
Okay.
So that's the last we heard on that. We do have confirmation that the Collision Course scenarios are going to be added into the Pendulum packet once they are released. So whether that turns into a curated list or if they just dump all the scenarios in there and you can choose to your heart's content, we're not really sure.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. It really opens things up for TOs, whether they want to random roll the scenario for each round or whatever.
Right.
Or do something more thematic with it. Like, there's a lot of options there.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited. Like talking about the thematic stuff is, they've talked about releasing narrative events like the First Contact one on a fairly regular schedule, and I really enjoy that. And even if they don't make it into the Pendulum packet, that's still fun scenarios that you can play with friends.
Oh, definitely. Everything doesn't have to be tournament focused.
Right.
And this game is more focused on narrative, anyways. This game lends itself really well to having these interesting stories play out on the battlefield. I think that's one interesting take that, like, the War Budgies battle reports go, is they do kind of try and focus more on that narrative. And this game kind of makes a narrative sometime with how skewy the dice can be. That you can have this model that does these things that should have never been able to do because these dice just let these things happen. So
you just got to call it a hero first.
You got to call it a hero. That's the rules. So the scenarios are also going to let you know how to interact with the objectives, because the objectives are not a static thing. Objectives are kind of defined by the scenario. There are some scenarios where objectives are just markers. They're not terrain. They aren't anything. They're just a marker. They're just wherever you need to be. You can be right on top of it. You're not getting covered. You're not getting anything. There are other scenarios where it does say that they are terrain and they provide cover. How you interact with that terrain is kind of up to whenever you're playing, or your EOTO if you're playing at an event. And then there's even in one of the First Contact missions, they specifically say you cannot have your base overlapping an objective. So just be careful and read your scenario and know how you interact with your objectives, because it is different from certain ones.
Yeah, the first skirmish scenario where only warrior models scored, I was so thrown off because I was like, wait, what? This is a thing in skirmish?
Right.
Caught me totally by surprise.
Okay, so I think we're going to run down the scenarios and kind of give our quick thoughts about each one, some highlights of what each one does and how it's different and unique. So we'll start with the skirmish missions. Does that sound okay?
Yep.
The first skirmish mission is actually my favorite. It's Boiling Point. Boiling Point, it's just 3 objectives. 2 of them are on one side of the board, one just outside of each player's deployment zone. The other objective is center on the board, but on the other side of the board. So kind of like a triangle on the board. These are terrain. They do provide cover. Anybody can score them, any units. And the scoring is all of them it's end of activation scoring. 1 point at the end of during the first pulse round, 2 points during the second pulse round, 3 points during the third pulse round. This is my absolute favorite scenario so far. I always have interesting, fun games on here. I see the battlefield kind of shift to where we're fighting for these 2, but the guy that's only got 1 needs to make a push to one of the other ones. So you have to try and figure out where you're going to fortify. It always leads to a really epic fight. I love this scenario.
Sometimes you have to make hero Aegis plays. Right, Josh?
I never want to talk about that game again.
I never thought I would ever arcane synthesis a single Aegis, but it happened.
Okay, well, give them some context. Tell them what you did, you monster.
So Josh had me in a really tough spot, and I was going second on the end of activation scenario, and he had a fighter Dust Wolf on my scenario that I needed to score. So I had nothing else that could do anything. So I just had this one Aegis that he had left alive right by the scenario, just all by itself, because he killed all the other models in the unit. And so I put an arc on something else. I don't remember what it did. And then I arcane synthesis the Aegis. So then the Aegis walks up on the other side of the Dust Wolf. 50-50 chance of it hitting, because it was 3 and 1 red dice versus 3 white dice. And then it hit, and I spiked off, and the Dust Wolf went flying off the scenario, and boom, scored it. Hero Aegis play. Let's go.
Yeah.
That's one of the best things about Warcasters. You'll do plays like that where it's, this really like weird corner case scenario thing that happens, and it happens or it doesn't, and it's like this big turning point in the game, and it's just they happen so often in the game. And so, like, I have so many games where I have so many, like, really fond memories or really, like, frustrating parts. I was like, oh, my God, can you believe this happened? That's one of the best parts about the game.
Yeah. Josh got me back, though, with a kinetic accelerated fighter Dust Wolf the next pulse round, though. So, yeah, it was disgusting.
That is disgusting.
Yeah, I killed a Weaver Marauder. Was it a Siege Breaker or a Marauder? A Siege Breaker.
Siege Breaker, yeah. And a Firebrand.
Oh, body count.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
That
body count is what won in the game.
Yep, I'm taking.
We'll get to secondaries. I think we'll save secondaries for the end of this episode, because I think we all have a lot of strong opinions about them.
Yeah.
Yes.
I know Dinah was talking about Boiling Point being his favorite scenario. That's just because we feel it's the most balanced of the scenarios currently, because of the end of activation scoring versus in a pulse round. That's really the main difference between it and the other scenarios available.
Well, what I also like is just the way that it's set up. Each player has this one basic home objective, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you're fighting over this third one, but then you over allocate to that one, then your home objective one isn't protected enough, and suddenly you have somebody attacking there. It's just every time I play that one, the battlefield shifts so much throughout the game. It's like me and Josh played a game recently, and his Strike Raptor literally went to like every objective on the board. It was absurd how far the Strike Raptor moved throughout the game. And it's just like, I'll remember that game forever, for better or for worse. I wish I could repress the memories of what happened to me that game. But, I'll remember that game, and it was epic, and it was awesome. And at Boiling Point, I get those games more often.
Yeah.
So, Sneaky, do you want to talk about your favorite skirmish scenario?
Yes. So we're going to talk about Chaos Theory. So that's my favorite skirmish scenario. So in this scenario, it is an end of pulse round scoring scenario. And in this one, each player also has a home objective. It's 6 inches up from the board edge, and it's centered on the 15-inch mark. And then there are 3 other objectives, all on the center line. The first one's 6 inches from the board, the third one's 6 inches from the other side of the board, and the middle one is smack dab in the middle at 15 and 15. And this is my favorite scenario because in this one, at the end of each pulse round, you roll a D3, basically, and one of those 3 middle scenarios goes away. So I like this one a lot because I like the randomness to a degree, but the awesome thing about this particular scenario is that because the 2 other points stay the same, and because of the way that the middle 3 are laid out, you can actually account for the randomness and place your void gates and place your models in such a way that you can plan for no matter which scenario goes away, you're still able to be relevant on scenario and contest them and still be present in the game. And if all else fails, you just go for one of the 2 that aren't going away. So I really like it because I do like that extra little level of meta-analysis that you have to have and that tactical thinking that you have to have throughout the game. So I really enjoy that extra depth and level of the game, and basically anything that adds depth to the game, I'm a big fan of. And that's why this is my favorite scenario in particular. The only issue with it is that it's in the pulse round.
Exactly.
And the second turn advantage is present. Other than that, it's a great scenario and it's super fun. And the best part is because of that randomness, every game is different. Every game is always different, but in this one, literally every game is different. It's a lot of fun. It's my favorite scenario for Skirmish, at least.
Yeah, my thoughts on this one, I would love this scenario if it was end of activation scoring. But my whole thing is I have a firm hatred for end of pulse round scoring. When I feel like the die to go first is the most important role throughout the game, I feel like that's just not a good feeling. Like, especially if in a tournament environment, any of these scenarios where you go into pulse round, like I just feel like I'm going uphill. I've got right from there, I've got a 20% chance to win the game, unless secondaries completely bail me out. I want to love this mission. I think this mission is really cool. I think the layout is awesome. I think that what's beautiful about this one compared to the other one we're going to talk about later, where the scenario the objectives go away, is that the objectives are close enough to where if your objective goes away, you can get back in the game with those units, usually, unless they're the slower ones. And then sometimes it can be hard. There is that whole mini game of trying to allocate your resources appropriately so that you're not having to scramble with those units. But at the same time, you have to go for that objective, right? So you want to put the least stuff on every one of them, but you also want to secure them. So it's very hard. It's very hard. Like I say, I would love this if it wasn't into pulse round scoring. I think this is such a deep scenario, but the into pulse round scoring kills me.
I'm just straight bad at it. So as much as I like the randomness, there's an extra layer of analysis where you have to think of what might be disappearing and what your coverage is. Having taken a break from the game, have had trouble wrapping my mind around that while trying to keep scenario presence at the same time. But I do agree with Justin in the sense that I think if it was end of activation scoring and not end of pulse round, it would be a phenomenal scenario.
And that's pretty much going to be what we're going to say about all the skirmish scenarios.
Right. I don't think any of us here have played an excessive amount of full battle size.
Correct.
But I have that feeling. I think that it's less of a situation in full battle force. I think it still exists there. I think it probably does. I'm going to say it does because I haven't played enough to say that firmly, and I'd rather have the experience behind me to say yes, this definitely is a issue there. But in Skirmish, at least, with scenario being so close to each other, every single one of these scenarios, all of the action happens in a 20 by 20 box. Because you cut off 5 inches from every board edge, and all the objectives are inside that. Most of the scoring space for the objectives is inside of that. So most of the action, 95% of the action, is happening in that 20 by 20 box. And, when a squad can move 9 inches, on just a regular move most of the time, or a strike raptor can go 9 inches when it spikes across that actual relevant part of the board. With it being such a small, tight area, end of pulse round means that you have so many things that can mess you up with very little you can really do about it.
And then going into the final skirmish mission that we have available within the Pendulum document, at least, we have the spontaneous combustion. You want to handle this one, Dino?
Yeah, so spontaneous combustion is a very interesting skirmish scenario because it takes that 20 by 20 box that I was talking about and it squishes it even further. There is a point in the dead center of the board, but then there are 2 points making a diagonal across the board with the 3 that are 9 inches in 2 different ways, making a diagonal across the board. This means that I think it's roughly 8 inches that all the scenario points are apart from each other. A warjack on one of them can walk over to the next one. You don't need arcane synthesis. If the back of your base is on the one, you can walk into the next one. They're very, very close. And the scoring for this one is a little different. So the one that is closest to your deployment zone, you will always score 1 point on that objective. The one in the center of the battlefield, you will always score 2 points on that objective. the one closest to your opponent's deployment zone, you will always score 3 points on that one. This one does not scale throughout the pulse rounds as far as the scoring goes, which I think is actually super interesting. It makes the first turn so much more important than it is in other missions. And while it is important in the other missions, because I've won and lost games by 1 and 2 points that I didn't get on those other pulse rounds.
Yeah.
But in this one, I feel like it's every turn matters so much more because there's 6 points available on the board. 1 for yours, 2 for the middle, 3 for your opponents. And, there's an extra little tug and pull of, hey, I need to defend mine from my opponent, but I really want to go for my opponent's. And then everybody wants the center one. So there's scrums and there's weight to different objectives in different ways, and I think it's a really cool scenario. I just think that it would be cooler on a larger map because it's just so scrunched. Everything can affect every other objective, and it's very hard to really defend against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, unless you're dropping like obscuring terrain or something in between the points or line of sight blocking stuff, then it's everything just affects everything. Like you can have a strike raptor.
Very lethal scenario.
Yeah, like you can have a strike raptor with no ace cortex rocking flamethrowers and just dropping flame on everything in both scenarios. It's
pretty crazy. It's a brutal scenario.
Yeah, and the one thing I've noticed a lot about this scenario is I feel like this scenario is the one where if someone gets ahead of the game, there's just no comeback, right? Like in this one, I feel like this one is where more second pulse round concessions happen than in any other scenario, because unlike the rest of them where they scale, and you can have a little bit of a comeback if you're down a little bit, but in this one, it's 6 points or bust. There's no scaling, so you always only have 6 points available. So if someone is up 6 points, then the game's pretty much over.
Well, and think about it, if you let your opponent score your objective even once, that can be so hard to catch back up on.
Yeah.
Because you have to score either both of the other objectives just to make parity, or you need to score, if you scored both the other ones, you'd score 5 points. But if they deny you from theirs, you actually can't make parity then. It's such a strange scenario, like from how the points work. And being into pulse round scoring, I do see this usually just end by the end of the second pulse round. There's just usually no way for the first turn player to come back.
Yeah, there can be a huge point swing. Huge.
Right. It's probably my least favorite skirmish scenario.
I would agree.
Of the ones in the packet. And I think that one suffers more from, the end of pulse round scoring than the other one.
Agreed.
Any final thoughts on the skirmish scenarios, guys? At least the ones from the primary. I think we'll glaze over the first contact ones, but not really go too in depth.
Yeah, we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's jump into the FBF.
Do you want to take Absolute Pressure?
Primary missions. Sure, I'll take Absolute Pressure because this one's weird.
This one's very weird.
All right, so for this one, this is the one that we were talking about earlier. This is the first mission on page 50 of the rulebook for the primary missions. So instead of having objective tokens that create your scoring zones like every other mission in the game, this one breaks the board up into 9 16 by 16 squares. And the way that you score is that players score 1 victory point at the end of each pulse round for each territory that they hold. Now, a player holds a territory if they control 1 or more models within the area of the territory while their opponent has none. So a model's base must be completely within the area of a territory to contest or control the territory. So this one's really interesting just because it's completely different from everything else in the game. And the really, really key thing there is that instead of worrying about units, you can score with models or contest with models. So what that means is that you can score with a mantlet, you can score with a void gate. A squad that's on a corner piece can spread out and contest 4 zones all at once. So it creates this really different, really weird way of scoring. And basically you have to spread out across the entire map, which I think is really cool, but it's just a very, very different scenario. I just don't really know how I feel about.
I also am kind of at a loss how I feel about this one, especially with things like the Gate Crasher and Eschatonic Well. Like, just imagine an ISA player coming into this and being like, okay, well, I've got a gate with 2 over there. I'll launch a gate over here with 3 on it. I'll Escatonic well a gate over here with 3, and they can just they can stop you from scoring every single square in the map with that.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah, especially with second turn advantage, like with some of that stuff, it's just crazy.
It is absolutely nuts. I think this one is going to be the weirdest one to play in person because you need to know where these corners are on these 16 by 16 scenario or like boxes that they make on the map, because knowing those points really lets you determine, like, honestly, if I was setting up this map, I would put a terrain piece at each of those corners. And that's partially just to stop somebody from putting a void gate right there with 5 arc on it, being like, well, I'm just going to stop, 4/9 of the map from being scoreable? Or, yeah, 4/9. It's like, okay, that one void gate going second can stop you from scoring 4 sections of the map. And there's nothing you can do about it unless you remove that gate. But they've probably got other things in that section, that, especially something that put that gate out. So it's a very weird scenario. I want to play it sometime, but like there's like this sense of dread in me about how annoyed I would get with it, especially going first. I feel like going first, this is just like the least fun scenario on the planet.
I haven't played it yet just because it terrifies me. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. It's weird. You want to handle decay constant, Dino?
Okay, decay constant. There are 6 objectives on this one, so this is our first one we're talking about with 6 objectives. There's 1 in every corner, 10 inches in from both table edges. There are 2 that are in the center of the board, but they're 18 inches up from each player's side. So direct center from the sides of the board, but 18 inches facing each other in the middle. So let's see here, that's 36. There's 12 inches between those 2. This one says, setup, place 6 permanent objectives onto the table as indicated by the map. Only squads can score score the objectives. So this is the first mission where we're seeing that's pretty true to full battle force, where squads are the focus. And that's a big part of full battle force, is that squads throughout these 48 by 48 size map missions are going to be what scores you most of your points. Scoring. Each player can score each strategic objective once per pulse round, and strategic objectives are scored when a squad ends its activation while securing an objective. So, end of activation scoring just for your squads. 1 victory point scored for the strategic objective during the first pulse round, 2 for the second pulse round, 3 points scored for the third pulse round. After the third pulse round is scored, the player with the most victory points wins the game. Now, I'm not seeing that the objectives give you any kind of cover. Normally, they will say that they are terrain pieces and they provide cover. This particular scenario is one of those where they are tokens. They are just table markers. They don't give you anything. When you're playing this mission and you're setting up a board for this mission in particular, be very cognizant of that when you're setting up terrain, because normally you need to be very careful about how you set up terrain so that you can actually interact with an objective that is kind of already giving you cover. These not giving you cover means you either want to add some to certain scenario pieces so that they are more interesting and you can actually hold them, or you don't, so that one's a bigger risk to hold. Another thing about this one is it feels like it's probably one of the higher scoring missions in the game right now. Because on all the skirmish scenarios, the max points I think you could get is 18. On 6, 12, and 18 that you could score potentially, you would be a demon if you scored that. Actually, no, you can only because it's end of activation scoring, you can actually only ever score 5 objectives per pulse round, because you can't activate 2 squads. Correct. And this scenario, just looking at it from a bird's eye view, this one seems pretty wild. I think it's one of those where it's very easy your first 2 pulse rounds, or your first pulse round, to just kind of score those 2 in your corners, the 1 in your center, and then just kind of have a little scrum for the 1 in the middle on your opponent's side. But then I think from there, after the first pulse round, I think this one goes wild. Because, then you've got those units up there to be putting gates on your opponent's side of the board, and I think it just opens up from there. So this one is one that I really do want to try. I feel like this one actually is super interesting, and not just because it's end of activation scoring. It's definitely got a flow to it that you can kind of see just by reading the scenario that is very unique to it. You have any thoughts, Nick?
Yeah, so here's this scenario is when I was talking about earlier, talking about end of activations and one of the limits of it. is because of the way that this scenario is scored, and you can only score with squads, and you can only score at the end of activation, it means that you're basically limited to only activating squads every single turn of the game. So it creates this really feels bad where you have your jacks and stuff that you want to activate because they're models that you bought and you painted and you want to play with them, and they're really cool and they're fun and they're strong.
Yeah, and they have a lot of output.
But you can't, because then you're giving up on scenario. The instant that you choose to activate a warjack, you have decided you are not scoring points that turn.
Ready.
So it's just not great design. It also really favors certain factions that have stronger squads versus others. Like ISA has really strong squads, Empyreans have really strong squads. ACE has some strong-ish squads now with access to the Raker and the Raiders. And then Marcher Worlds, their infiltrators are crazy. And then with the amount of squads that are on the board, I bet the heavy weapons team is real happy in this scenario. It's just very limiting, and I'm not a fan of that limitation.
That's
right?
a really good point. It does feel like anytime you activate a non-squad, you're only hurting your chances to score.
Yep. Now, a really easy fix for this scenario is, instead of it being squads, just make it warrior models. That way my solos can score too. Then that opens up a whole new level of possibilities. And I can use all of my stuff. Everything is relevant. And then that's when I think this particular scenario gets crazy and just becomes like Dino was talking about, just this super scrum fest that you're moving all over the board, dropping void gates everywhere, just trying to contest as much of the board as possible. And I think that is really, really fun. Whereas in this scenario, it's my squad activates, tries to kill your squad, and my solo activates and tries to kill your squad, and that's what happens every single turn.
Yeah.
Right?
It does definitely sound like a much more interesting and actual fun to play scenario when you allow solos to score too. Feeling this obligation in full size as an AC player with Kickstarter 1 stuff, it already feels like a I've got to use these squads kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then going to the point where it's like you have to activate them every turn to even have a chance. It's a real feels bad. I think adding the solos to it, I think on the one hand, it kind of takes away a little bit of what they were trying to do, whereas they wanted your squads to be more of a focus. But on the other hand, it makes it a much more fun and engaging scenario. I get what they were going for, right? It makes sense that they want you to have these decision points. I guess I'm not going to activate a squad this turn because I need to contest that. My thing over here is the only thing that can do that. And now, I've done the sacrifice, but it's so that I can win elsewhere. Mm-hmm. I get that. It's an interesting thought pattern they make you go through, but I don't think it's necessarily a fun thought pattern to go through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially when you're activating that one squad that's just in the back on a point that your opponent just gave up on, and so literally all you're doing is you're activating them just to score the points. So it's just not fun. It's cool, I activate this squad, I score this point. All right, next. That's my turn. It's not as engaging as it could be.
Right.
Now, my favorite full-size mission is up next. So
this one's really cool.
So for this one, it's called Orders of Magnitude. And so you have 6 scenarios, right? And each player or 6 objectives, and each player has a 1, 2, and 3 on their side of the board, and it's arranged in basically a hexagon. Each player's 1 scenario is 10 inches up from the board, right at the midline at 24 inches. And then 2 and 3 for both of them are 10 inches off the sides of the board and then 18 inches up. So it creates this really cool hexagon in the middle of the board.
And those two seem really close to each other. That's 12 inches from each other?
10 and 18 and 18, 36, 12 inches. Yes, they are.
Yeah, that seems very live to me.
Now, the interesting thing is that, and this is relevant, so each player's 2 and 3 are what's across from each other. Now, that's important because at the start of each pulse round, you roll a d3 to determine which drop zone objectives are active. So what that means is that when you score, whichever one is active scores 3 points, and the other ones score 1 point. So it adds that little bit of randomness into the game that I think makes things interesting, but all the points are still static, so you can plan for it, which we know that I enjoy. And the cool thing is that the points that are always going to be the ones that are directly across from each other on the map. The ones that are worth 3 points are always going to be the furthest points away from each other on the map. So it definitely adds this really cool randomness that keeps the game alive, interesting, and makes you move around the board, which I really, really enjoy. I just think it's a really well-designed scenario.
I think this one's really cool too. And just a note, this is, I think, the only other scenario where the objectives do not provide cover.
No, actually, yeah, they do not provide cover. There is
they are just tokens in this one as well.
There is one other one where one of the objectives does not provide cover, but the other ones do. But in this one, none of the objectives provide cover. And this one is an end of pulse round scoring scenario, which, like we've talked about, second turn advantage is present in FBF, but because things are so spread out and you can't affect as much of the map with any one single activation, it's not as relevant as in Skirmish, but it is still present.
Right. I think this one is just really well designed. I'm not sure. This one, I'm not even sure if it actually lends itself that well to end of activation scoring. Like if you were to, go through the thought process of maybe changing it to that, just because then you have that lucky player that's going first and gets the right objectives and he can just score them both. And suddenly there's a pulse round there where he just has to defend those two and he's already scored 2 up on his opponent if he can just hold those 2.
Yeah.
So it does lead to some really weird swings in the way the game works. And you can have duplicates of the active points, right?
You mean like if...
it says reroll the results if the same one is active. So actually what that means is you can, as the first player, you can already start getting units into position for the next pulse round because the 2 that you're on are not going to be active the next pulse round.
Correct.
So it's got a very interesting flow, and I think it's a really well designed, really cool scenario, and I really hope to see some more like this.
Yeah. Now, for this scenario, this is also only squads can score, but because it is an end of pulse round scoring scenario, you don't have to activate a squad in order for it to score. So if you summon a squad in and displacement index them on there, or a fulcrum repositions them on there, or they're still there and alive from last pulse round, as long as you keep that squad alive, they never have to activate. So it gives you more options as far as what you're actually able to activate and be relevant with throughout the game. Right.
It still forces you to summon those squads, but it doesn't force all of your activations to be squads.
Correct.
So I think I just think this is probably, just from what I haven't played that many full-size games, but I think this is probably one of my favorites.
I like this one a lot.
And I'm very against end of pulse round scoring, but I think this one leads to a really interesting style of gameplay where it makes it to where end of pulse round scoring is not the worst. So yeah, I definitely do really like this scenario. Okay, the next one is Strange Matter. Strange Matter is a very hard one to describe how it's deployed, but here we go. There are 4 objectives that are in the corners, 16 inches up from each player's deployment zone, 12 inches in from the edges. And then there are 3 portable objectives in the middle of the board, 1 dead center, and then there are 2 more that are equally 10 inches away from the corner points. But they're not... It's weird. The math is, they don't put how far up from the center they are. They just put it's 10 inches away from both of those corner points. So it makes this weird triangle that they don't give you the number for. It's very strange. So that's the way it's set up. The corner points do provide cover. Squads and solos can hold ruin objectives, which are the corner points. And any unit models can carry the portables. Scoring. Players score victory points at the end of each pulse round for each of those corner objectives they score. 1 during the first pulse round, 2 during the second, 3 during the third. 2 additional victory points are scored per ruin if a model is holding an artifact objective is securing it. So if you are securing one of those corner points while holding a portable objective, meaning you have to have a squad or a solo holding that portable objective because warjacks cannot secure those. You can't secure the corner objectives. then you get an additional 2 victory points for that. This one seems like there's going to be a mad rush. It's like the dodgeball of scenarios. Like, everybody's running towards the middle to grab all the balls and then bring them back to their side and just hold on to them and try and score with them. It really leads to stagnant style of gameplay, in my opinion, where you're likely to probably get one on each side and then you're scrumming for that third one. And then maybe there'll be people doing like breakaway plays to try and grab your other objectives and stop you from scoring those anyways. But the first pulse round, I completely see this just being, hey, let's get one of those portables, bring it back to our regular objective, and at least score that. I think there's a lot of potential with this scenario. I haven't played it out. It's a very strange one. I think this is them trying to play around with the portable objectives and just seeing what they can do with it.
Yeah, we played it once, but it was so long ago. Now I know a little trick that Red says that they do is they'll use warjacks to scoop up portable objectives in order to deny them from their opponent, right? Which is pretty cool.
Put a double shield Morningstar holding one. I'm probably not getting rid of him for very soon.
Yeah. And then it also creates this really interesting decision point throughout the game where it's like, cool, do I need to go for the scenario? Do I need to kill that piece that is holding, that my opponent has, that's holding an objective that is going to be able to get over onto his point next turn? Do I need to protect my objective carrier dude? It creates a lot of really interesting decision points throughout the map or throughout the game, and I think that's really interesting. So I like it.
I think this one might even exacerbate that second turn advantage, because you get a chance to pick off those solos and units that are holding those portables.
Mm-hmm.
And, your opponent doesn't get that same chance on you. So if you happen to be holding one at the end of their last pulse round and you happen to kill their solo or unit that's carrying that portable for them,
mm-hmm.
then you can create this 2-point deficit without actually having to move onto their point or anything.
Right.
This one, it was a very long time we played that. And I do remember most of the game was, we kind of ignored the center one even. And I think we just grabbed those two and brought them back. And then it was just trying to reach out a little bit and dig at those spots.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah, I think that's about the sum of how ours played out. It's definitely, I think there's something there. I think it's just a very, I wonder if it was like end of activation scoring and if the portable objective disappeared, if I would be more interested. But as it sounds to me, it's like one of those where being end of pulse round scoring, this one sounds miserable to me.
Cool. And then I'll let you take the next one as well, because I want to take the last one.
Uh-oh. So the next one is surface tension. This one almost looks like a 5 on a D6. There's a objective in each corner, 12 inches from both table edges, and one in the dead center. Objective marker in the center represents an arc geyser platform, and the arc geyser platform does not provide cover. The 4 objectives in the corners are mooring anchors. Mooring anchor objectives are considered to be terrain features that provide cover. Only squads can hold objectives. Players score victory points at the end of each pulse round for each objective they secure. 1 victory point is scored for objectives closest to the player's starting battlefield edge, 2 points for the objective in the center of the table, and 3 points for the objectives closest to the opponent's side of the battlefield. So this one is really cool. I think this one kind of does what that third skirmish scenario does, but does it better. This one, I remember this was one of the first full Battle Force missions I played, and I actually super enjoyed this one. It made this really tug of war going on of, well, I want to be reaching out, but I want to be defending. And the objectives are far enough away to where it's pretty easy to fight over the center one, but you actually have to make an actual effort to kind of get to your opponents and to stay on that side of the board. And I think it really makes a really interesting tug of war. And I think this one is another really interestingly designed full-size scenario, just because, between my objectives in the corner and yours, there's 24 inches. So there's not really much in the game that can interact with it in one turn, unless you're like a Marcher Worlds squad with displacement index, because then you can get like 21 inches. So I think it does add a really interesting, like it takes what the other one was trying to do and does it right. And I feel like this one kind of boils down to a big scrum in the middle and a bunch of sub fights on each of the other objectives. and just trying like hell to defend your own. So I think this one looks really fun. I really want to play this one.
So that is the one that I have experience with. And I will say that when I played it, it came down to kind of like you said, a scrum in the middle, each person defending their own points. And I ended up winning, but only because, like you said, I displacement indexed a Ranger Fire Squad to get them across the board to my opponents. And I snaked it on the very last round to win.
Yeah. This one is even probably more okay that it's into pulse round scoring just because the objectives are also far enough apart to where it's not like you're going to have a million things in range to contest any one objective. So this one is, I do like this one. Did you like the game you played, Josh? Did it feel like a game?
Yeah. Oh, I was a big fan of it. It was super competitive and close. No one felt out of the game at any point. There was trading happened every round because the objectives are a good distance away, but it's not like you couldn't shoot from one to another.
That's Marcher World's privilege.
Okay. My view's a little jaded.
Yeah, I mean, the longest range in my faction is 14. So I actually can't shoot from the one to the other one. So, you know.
Okay, my bad. My bad. Yeah. Okay, so as a Marcher Worlds player, I really like this scenario. We'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, spread out points where, your movement matters, your long range matters. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay, let's move on.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about the final mission in the packet, which is Uncertainty Principle. Now, if y'all have listened to our Pendulum packet or Pendulum episode, you know how I feel about this. So the way that this map is set up, so each player has two objectives on their side of the board that are 10 inches from the board edge on both sides, which is like skirmish level distance. And then there are two objectives in the center of the map that are both 20 inches from the board edge, centered on the 24-inch line. The way that this scenario works is so only squads can hold the matrix nodes, which is normal. They are considered to be terrain features that provide cover. But at the end of the first pulse round, after scoring, you roll a d6 twice and remove the corresponding nodes. So each one is numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you're going to remove 2 points completely at random. So that means that the 2 center nodes could go away. And then now you're fighting over 4 objectives that are 28 inches away from each other at the shortest. Right, so not even Marcher Worlds is getting there.
They actually can if they have the purple one that lets the unit move first.
Yeah, I mean that requires like 2 turns of setup, but yeah,
you have 5 turns.
It is possible. It is possible. Or one player could have both of theirs and their deployment zones go away, which is just atrocious. So it's just completely random. And then at the end of the second pulse round, you get rid of another one. So 3 out of the 6 go away by the end of the game. It is scored 1, 2, 3 at end of pulse round, and it's just so random. We played this map once, and I said never again because
he also had the very worst scenarios leave for him. It was like the one that in his zone in the corner that he had decided to stay on, and he had made a hard push for my side on the one like on the same side in the corner on mine, and those are the 2 that went away, and one had I think his Strike Raptor on it.
Yeah.
And they're so far apart on everyone but the ones in the middle that it's like, well, this is going to be like a 2 or 3 activation like commitment to get the Strike Raptor back in the game, and it just wasn't worth it to him again to activate a Strike Raptor for the rest of the game.
Yeah, it was real bad. Like I tried to spread my forces out and it didn't even matter. So it was real painful. Now I did promise in our last episode that I had came up with an idea for how to fix this scenario. And so my idea is that at the end of the first pulse round, each player, so you roll a die and it'll have corresponding points similar to in the order of magnitude, where whatever shows up, both players delete one of their objectives that is in their deployment zone. right? So that way it's parity. Both players know they're losing an objective in their deployment zone at the end of this round. And then in the second pulse round, you delete one of the two in the center. So it gives you knowledge about what is going away, so that way you can actually play around it and be prepared for the randomness, but it still adds randomness to the game, which I enjoy because it keeps things flowing and moving and keeps things interesting, especially in a game like Warcaster where you can, move your void gates and deploy tactically and things, and it's not just, two armies scrumming in the middle of the board. A lot of other war games. So I think that change would make it really interesting, and I think then it could be a cool scenario that would at least be playable. I don't know if it's completely balanced or it's, an amazing scenario, but it's playable. Right now, Uncertainty Principle is not playable, at least not in a tournament setting.
How about this for an idea? What if you knew which ones were going away? What if you rolled at the beginning of the pulse round and you knew which ones were going? So you knew that, like, say, and maybe there would be a rule that you can't have two on the same side of the board go away. So that way, I know you're not going to have any in your deployment zone next turn, so why would I put forces over there, But, if you knew which ones were going away, so there was value to still getting those zones because they will give you objective points. They'll give you VPs, but they're going away, so whatever you throw that way is probably going to be out of the game for a turn or two. Do you think that would kind of balance the scenario a little bit?
I'm not a fan of it because I don't like the pre-knowledge and how that's going to impact how you deploy and move things throughout the game, because basically it's just going to be, especially if it's something in your deployment zone, it's like, okay, cool, I put one squad on here, that's going to go away. I put the squad that I care the least about, and then I'm not worried about them for the rest of the game, right? Like, I'm sacrificing that squad. I don't care about it. It is out of the game at this point. And then it also just depends, like, if you're keeping, like, how random it is, because then it could still just be crazy. So, no, I'm not a fan.
I mean, I think this one, just with how far they are and just removing anything at random, it can lead to a crazy experience regardless, right? Even if you, I think that one player can just get in a lot of trouble with just whatever gets removed at random.
Yeah,
so
at least with knowing that it's gonna be things in the deployment zone first round, and it's on parity that they're each gonna lose one, and that there's one in the center, that then you can set yourself up so you can keep your forces limited, right, in the first round, and set yourself up for the second round fighting over the center. And then once the ones that go away are gone, they're going to stay there. So then you can start spreading out into those 2 points. So it kind of changes up the tempo of the game a little bit, because where you're running into the middle first, and then you're spreading out to the sides later, because one of the two in the middle are going to go away next. So you can't be, certain they're going to be there. So it creates this really interesting flow to the game, I think, with that setup.
Yeah. But as it is, I think we all agree that, Uncertainty Principle is if you see that one and you're at a tournament, you're just like, oh, I just don't even want to play this game.
Yeah. It's like, cool, I play the first pulse round, and then depending on what the roll is, I might just concede at that point.
Right.
It's you shouldn't be conceding at the end of the first pulse round based off something that you have literally zero impact on.
Yeah,
well, you can position to deal with it.
Slightly, but I can
Not really.
speak from a bit of experience. Those random disappearing objectives feel bad.
Yeah.
But in a game that already has randomness in it, with both dice on yours and your opponent's part, further affecting things randomly in at least a competitive scenario is bad in my opinion. But from a narrative standpoint, it's probably fine.
Yeah. It's just my issue with this scenario is that there's zero way to account for the randomness. None at all. And that's my issue with this scenario.
Okay. So, that's all of the 9 scenarios that you'll see in Pendulum. Do we want to just briefly gloss over some of the things we think are cool about the first contact scenarios?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about Arc of Shadows. I know you have feelings about the other one. So Arc of Shadows is really cool because it basically combines Chaos Theory and Boiling Point, where there's a triangle, like in Boiling Point, where across the map, each player has 1 point, near their deployment zone. Then there's one, in the middle of the board on the other side of the board. But then there's also one right in the middle of the map. And the chaos theory part is that the triangles go away at the end of the pulse round. So you're going to roll a d6, 1, 2, and 3, or roll a d3, and then one of them is going to go away at the end of each pulse round. So I like this one because, again, it adds some randomness. It keeps things flowing. But because of that center one that always stays, and just because of the way that you can maneuver yourself and you can prepare for the randomness and position yourself in a way to make sure that you're still relevant on scenario no matter what. So I enjoy this one a lot. The really interesting thing about this one is that it is designed for a 6 units with no heroes is your force list for this one. Now, I've played this a lot with your normal 8 and 1 skirmish, but I've also played it with the 6 units with no heroes like it's designed for. And it creates a really interesting game, being limited to 6 units. And it's also great for bringing in new players because you can go from a battle box game straight into this. All they have to do is pick up, another solo and another unit, and they've got their 6 units from the battle box, and then they can grow into, a full-size skirmish. So it creates a really, really awesome, slow grow opportunity for newer players to get into.
Okay. Did you want to say anything about that one, Josh? I haven't played that one, and I know that you guys have plenty enough of experience on it that I know that you guys talk about it.
Well, this is the scenario that Josh does not like with the randomness.
Yeah. Is there anything on this subject I can say that I didn't already say? It's fun, don't get me wrong. My opinion is just jaded due to having bad luck for what has disappeared, and to me not having the forethought to account for the fact that stuff around me is going to disappear.
Yeah, and I was playing a game yesterday on this map with someone, and at the end of the pulse round, they placed a void gate somewhere, and I was like, I coached them a little bit. I was like, hey, look, so this is how this scenario works, right? So if you put that void gate there, if this scenario goes away, everything you drop out of that void gate is going to be out of scenario. So if instead you put it over here, even if this scenario that it's near goes away, it's still able to contest the center scenario. Puts you in a better position to be able to stay relevant regardless.
And that's an important thing in any mission, is figuring out those spots that you can put your void gates to where whatever you spawn out of them can really interact with as much of the scenario as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a talent that you kind of have to play a few games and realize. Because I know I've seen other players summon out of a void gate and have, say, a marauder that's more than 6 inches away from an objective. Well, that marauder is effectively out of the actual pull of the game for 2 turns then.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think that's one of those things that as you play games and as you get used to things, you'll notice these things and be like, oh, well, I don't want to put this marauder out of this, or I need to position this gate to where whatever comes out of it can actually interact with scenario.
Yeah, and our first casted episode on Essex War Games YouTube channel is a great example of us talking about being relevant on scenario and placing your void gates in places that are gonna be relevant.
Stop sending people to my shame.
Okay, so we're ready to talk about Dawn Raid.
You won that game.
Oh yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Take Dawn Raid.
Dawn Raid is the second mission in this packet, and I have such a love-hate for this mission. I love that they took a lot of chances with this mission, chose to do a lot of very unique things from every other mission. There are so many things in this mission that are different than any other mission that I love that. I love that they're taking chances. They're trying to learn what they can do with the game, what works for the game, what people are going to like. I love that. I think that's great. What I don't like is that it is so heavily in favor of the second player. It's in a pulse round scoring, so I already feel there's a second player advantage. And then this scenario in particular just exacerbates that. it really frustrates me. So this is like, if I had to vote for a best worst scenario, it's this one. So this scenario, what's really cool about it is it's got a circle right dead center in the board with an objective, and that is one player, the second player's deployment. No, that's the first player's deployment zone. I'm sorry. Now, what's interesting about that objective is that objective is, I think, only ever worth 1 for the defending player.
Correct.
So the second player has one objective out of these 3 that is only ever worth 1 point. Then you have the attacker whose deployment zones are actually on the sideboard edges for the map, and there's an objective 4 inches from the top edge and the bottom edge, and 10 inches from the attacker's board edge. The deployment zones are even different. It's a little hard one to explain, but the objectives for the attacker, those two for both players are worth whatever pulse round it is. So 1 for the first pulse round, 2 for the second pulse round, 3 for the third pulse round. But that defender's deployment objective is always worth 3 for the attacker. So you have this weird situation where there's an objective in the middle of the board that one player only ever scores 3 on, and the other player only ever scores 1 on. I think that's an interesting thing to have different scoring for different objectives. I've talked about that in the other missions that do that. I think it's an interesting idea, but to have it just be a universally bad objective for one person who's the first player that doesn't get to deal with end of pulse round scoring, well, it's just an infinitely good one and worthwhile one to attack for the other player is just such a feels bad for player number 1. One unique thing about this also is that objective happens to also be defensive weaponry. So warrior models can do an action next to it and shoot a range 16 PAL 5 blast weapon. And the last super interesting thing they have about this scenario is that on the first player's first turn, the second player, all their models are considered to have stealth. I think this is actually a super cool thing for like skirmish. Because one thing that I know that I've seen a lot is being able to attack people's deployment zones. This one, you're going to be able to attack the opponent's deployment zone because you're not very far from it. But it adds like this really cool like way to mitigate that feels bad of, well, you just killed my really expensive model that I never got to activate, or oh, you knocked my squad down to 1 guy on the first turn before I ever got to do anything with them. I think that's this scenario really tries to think outside the box on so many points, with different scoring points, with points being weapons, with different deployment zones that aren't necessarily equal, with the second player having stealth the first turn. There's so much interesting and so much that they're stretching and trying for in this scenario that I love the effort. And I kind of, as much as I feel like this scenario is, if you win the die roll, you just win the game. I think that I wanted to see some more of this ingenuity in the Pendulum packet. I wanted to see like 2 or 3 scenarios that were new and unique and trying some of these things to try and make like this weird balance, like a weird balance while being unequal, if that makes sense. So I love this scenario for what it's trying to do. I just hate it for its execution.
Yeah. Another thing that gives the second player advantage is also because of the way the deployment zones and the objectives are set up, is that they can always put a void gate within a couple of inches of either objective. So
either of the side objectives.
Yeah.
Whereas the defending player can only put it in that circle near the one objective. Mm-hmm. It's very awkward. But I'm gonna clap for them, commend them. Like this is the kinds of things I want to see them testing out and trying out while the game is new, and trying to see what, just throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And I think this scenario just shows like the variety of things you can throw into these scenarios to make for a very, very interesting scenario.
I will say I've played that scenario twice now. Once against Spencer and once against Jay from Charge and Spike. And I've enjoyed it both times I've played.
Were you attacker both times?
Both times I was attacker.
Well, of course you enjoyed that.
I lost
You're the second player.
No, well, that's the thing. I lost the roll both times. I'm pretty sure the person that won the role put me as attacker. I just think like it's a very cool, feels very thematic that you're like sieging this center point. Both maps I played on were very different, so they lended themselves to a different experience each time. The first game was kind of like a walled off like point in the center. You were kind of in like a jungly kind of zone, and then the second one was in like literally in the middle of a metropolis. And I agree with your assessment of the scenario that it is very sloped towards the second person, but I enjoyed it for its thematicness and its uniqueness, not so much the fact that I got to go second both times and had a glaring advantage.
Well, it was even worse because in your game that I saw, you guys misunderstood the way the terrain was and thought that there was this barricade basically around the objectives on the sides that made it even harder for the first player to get to them. It's just like that was.
Yeah, and then when Josh and I played, we just played the scenario all wrong. But
yeah,
but I still won because Nova cannons and phase projectile cannons are amazing.
I even tabled Spencer for God's sakes, and he still came back to whoop me. So
well, and that shows how strong going second is, right? I know I've tabled somebody going second when I was going first. It was Spencer. It's the only video I ever recorded. And I tabled him. I pulled back all my art just so I could do this power play to table him. And it did no good because I couldn't table whatever he summoned. And that was enough to contest all the points against me. And it just didn't matter that I had made the sacrifice to get table advantage. It was a very weird game. I don't know. And maybe that game is maybe the pinnacle of why I'm so against into pulse round scoring.
Yeah, it's real feels bad when someone goes from having nothing on the board except for a void gate to going up like 4 points.
It was a lot because it was also even exacerbated by the one. I think it was that mission where that third skirmish mission we talked about, where you score 3 for my objectives and all that jazz. So it was very weird. I was so frustrated at the end of that game.
Fair. Now moral of the story. Dawn Raid, really cool, really interesting, very, very skewed to the second player. So we hope they try out some more stuff, keep doing these interesting maps, but hopefully they can figure some things out balance-wise. Now Bones of Giants is our first FBF scenario. So this one is interesting because it is a 11 unit and 2 hero full battle force primary mission. So this is what led us to believe that the Pendulum document, the Pendulum 11 and 2, was going to be full battle size. But we talked about that in our last episode. So if you want to hear more about our thoughts on that, check that one out if you haven't already. Now, for this one, it's really interesting because there's 2 drop point objectives that don't actually score that are near each player's deployment zone. And then there are 3 objectives spaced out across the center line of the map. So the 2 on the far sides are 8 inches from the board edge, and then the one in the center is smack dab in the center, 24 inches from each edge. The interesting thing is that on this one, both squads and solos, so basically warrior models, can score the centerline objectives. Now, each of those centerline objectives also has the possibility of generating a portable objective. So at the beginning of the game, you roll a d6, or roll a d3, whatever you roll, the other 2 objectives get a portable objective. Now, this objective can only be carried by jacks and vehicles. And the way that they pick it up is they have to be base to base with the objective while it is being secured by a squad or solo that you have. And then they can take that portable objective back to your drop point and score you 3 points. Now, the other ones, the 1, 2, and 3 objectives, score like normal with 1 point during the first pulse round, 2 during the second, 3 during the third. So it's really interesting. The drop points are pretty far from the other objectives, and so you kind of have to do this like relay race thing in order to get something back to your drop point. And your drop point also has to be secured by your own models. Now, it can be the warjack itself, so basically it just means that it can't be contested by your opponent. in order for you to score it, and they have to be base to base with that as well. So this is a little bit different because normally with all objectives, and including portal objectives, you just have to be within 1 inch of it. But for this one, it has to be base to base. So it creates this really weird, really interesting, like multi-turn plan in order to get something back to that drop point, unless you have something like a nemesis that is spiking for 18 inches worth of movement, right?
Right.
Because even an interceptor or a scythe can't make it from the closest point to your drop point in one activation, which are the 2 other fastest models in the game. The Nemesis can just barely do it. Now, what I've found playing this particular map a couple of times now is that the portal objectives are basically useless. It winds up just being, a skirmish in the middle of the map, usually on like 2 of the points. So basically one player will like lock down 1 point and then you're scrumming over the other 2. So it's definitely interesting. I mean, it's fun for sure. And I really like what they did with it and where they were going with it. I just feel that it just doesn't become as...
It isn't relevant enough.
Yeah, it's not relevant enough, or like in War Machine terms, like it's not live enough. Now, like there's things that you can do with it, and it's possible to score it, but it's just really hard, really hard, and requires a lot of resource investment in order to make it happen, which means you're losing out on other scenario.
I completely agree. It's a very they added this little mini game into it, and I think that if those drop points were a little bit closer, it would actually be very live and would be very impactful. But as it is, I think they're just far enough away to where you don't want to spend 2 activations getting your vehicle, sometimes 3, depending on what you're trying to get that portable to that drop point. You don't want to spend that many activations just getting this thing, inching it closer to that objective. And then there's just the chance that it gets shot down or whatever anyways.
Yep. Plus, once it's there, it's usually out of scenario at that point because it's just so far away from everything else.
Trying to get resources there to even pick it up and take it over to the other point it's very hard. I think it's a really cool idea. Like I say, I see them doing these interesting things to try and add elements to scenarios that aren't necessarily just secure these 3 objectives. I see them trying to do these kinds of things, and I think it's really cool. Like I say, I think that one, if those drop points, I think if they're knocked up like 6 inches closer to the center, it becomes. There's even arguably it's too live then, right?
Yeah. I think 6 inches is too much. Like I think maybe 3 inches would probably be
right.
The sweet spot.
There's a little area where it's like, is this too live or is this not live enough? And if you cross either of those lines, it's either not interesting or it takes over the scenario. So it's very interesting. I think it's cool, and I love to see them reaching for things. I hope to see more of it because I think we can all agree Pendulum is kind of like a first draft at what the competitive packet can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hope that they get data from this. I hope they see especially these missions, because these missions have these interesting new things added to them. I hope they get some feedback from these, and they're like, okay, well, let's just hone this in a little bit, and then I hope they learn a lot from these and try to learn how to like tighten the screws just a little bit to make it to where these things are impactful enough to be fun and useful, but not to where they take over games.
Yeah, I'm super excited to see the new scenarios that pop up in Collision Course. Can't wait.
Me too.
Plus, playing the same couple of scenarios for a year is, I want more stuff. Give me new toys, PP. Give me new toys.
Are we ready to talk about the last one?
Yeah.
Okay, this one is mind-blowing, but I think this one adds some really cool stuff. So this is a scenario that has a very basic setup. It's got 5 objectives. This is on a 48 by 48 map. There's one in the dead center, and there's one in the dead center of each table edge, 10 inches away from that table edge. So it's like it's like the other one where we made the 5 on the dice, but turned it. So just a very basic setup. So what happens then is each player should set aside 5 Tinker tokens to be used during the mission. Squads and solos can hold these ancient artifact objectives. You can then take warrior models to make a tinkered action on these objectives to put a tinkered token on them. When you do that, here's the tinker special action. This model can make a tinker special action while within 1 inch of an ancient artifact permanent objective secured by friendly models that does not already have one of your tinkered tokens on it. Place a tinkered token on the objective and roll a d6 and an action die to determine the effect. Now, I'm not going to read through this chart, but these effects are crazy. Like the very first one, each model within 2 inches of this objective suffers a POW X explosion damage roll. And the action die, if it's a blank, it's a POW 5 explosion. If it's a 1 strike, it's a POW 4, and if it's a 2 strike, it's a POW 3 explosion. So you've just made sure that no enemies are within 1 inch of this objective, and then it's blown up on at least some of your guys, but maybe a lot of your guys. But you have that Tinker token there. What's important about that is scoring. Remove Tinker tokens from the table at the end of each pulse round. Players score victory points for each token of theirs that is removed. 1 victory point during the first pulse round, 2 during the second, 3 during the third. By the way, that's only one of 6 possible things you can do when you apply these Tinker tokens to objectives. I think this mission, I haven't played it. This is actually like the first time I'm reading it. This mission is super cool. I think having these things that you can interact with objectives, it's almost like end of activation scoring, but not at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
It's just very cool. It adds this element where it's I don't even know if first or second player would be advantaged in this one. It actually doesn't say that an objective can only ever have 1 Tinker token on it, so you can still both get a chance to score all these objectives. It adds that randomness that Sneaky was talking about that he likes, because the first one is that explosion, like the second one heals models next to it. There's one that adds armor. There's one that gives you a random number of victory points. There's all these cool effects that can happen as soon as you put a Tinker token on these objectives that I think is just, it's really crazy and interesting.
The other super interesting thing about this is how it affects your activation economy. Because unlike in other scenarios where all you have to do is get someone in a particular spot, in this scenario, you have to get them there and they have to make an action. So that means before whatever that model makes that action, you already have to clear that objective, which means that something else is going to have to do it for you. If it's a solo or if it's a squad, then the rest of your squad has to clear it, and then the last guy has to do the special action. So it creates this really interesting activation economy part of the game. Yeah, like you said, it's this weird like end of activation thing, but also adds this like crazy activation economy. So it's really cool. It's really
and it even adds like that random factor that you seem to like from some of the other objective scenarios where it's like, well, I don't even know what's going to happen when I do this action. Anything could happen. I could lose my squad. I could score an extra victory point or 2. I could, there's just like these random things that could happen that are just both interesting or they're either great or terrible or, it's really just all over the place and you never know what's going to happen. And I think it's just one of those things that Warcaster lends itself to these big moments in games. And like I say, this is another one of those I can see having those big moments. It's like, well, you were winning the game until you put a POW 5 blast on your whole squad, and now you lost that squad, so now you've lost agency in this part of the board. So I might be able to go put my Tinker token on, and I got these extra victory points, but you had more Tinker tokens. Like there's this whole big line of things that can happen, and I think it's super cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really, really cool. I'm super excited to play this. This is the next mission in the final mission of the TTS League. So we'll be playing this in about a week and a half, and I'm super excited for it.
I'm super excited to see games. I hope we do a shoutcast for one of these games, because this looks like a super, super interesting game.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of what I want to see more of.
You guys can shoutcast my game and tell me everything I did wrong, like that last cast you keep seeming to send people to.
It's a good learning cast.
Yeah, that one's a great learning cast.
Thanks,
That's
guys.
why we like doing the cast, because like we can sit there and analyze things and people can learn from it instead of just being like, oh, well, looks like Josh lost.
Yeah, so just so you guys know, I'm bad for all your benefits.
And so we've gone through every scenario that we currently have available to us. And, we've gone over the good and the bad. But in Pendulum, well, there were already secondary objectives you could be playing, secondary missions you could be playing in the full-size game. The rulebook had specifically limited them from Skirmish. With the advent of Pendulum, now they've been added to Skirmish. So what I think we should do is just read through there's 5 secondary missions you can choose from. Just go through each of them real quick, say what's good, what's bad, and just give our thoughts on each one. Does that sound right to you guys?
Yep.
Okay, I'll read them and then we'll talk about them. Because I want to save a specific one for last, because I think it's the most problematic of them all.
I was literally about to say that.
So secondary mission Salvage. Each time a squad you control destroys an enemy warjack with a melee attack, score 2 victory points.
Yay,
Spencer,
infiltrators. I said yay, infiltrators. I think
Yeah.
Marcher
Now, I
World.
think this one in particular gives Marcher Worlds a big heads up on everybody.
Yes, I agree.
If this one is good, it gives Marcher Worlds a big advantage. Personally, think it's too limiting to be good.
I think it's too limiting as well, but I was like, if there is a squad that can capitalize on it, it is the infiltrators, because they have insane melee capabilities.
Being the only Mat 4 squad in the game, I think that's very true.
With the ability to be Mat 6.
Yes. And they have PAL 5 on one of their weapons.
Yep.
Yes. And that squad has PAL 5 weapons. It isn't like although I will say ISA with their one new Cypher card, they can have a Mat 5 PAL 5 squad with 3-inch reach. So there is that.
They're probably
That's
second
true.
for sure.
I just think this one overall is too corner case. What you're going to want to do is have something else set up, this jack, to be on 1 or 2 points, to 1 or 2 health to get it to where the squad is likely to kill it. Mm-hmm. And even then it feels a little bit dicey.
The amount of times I've summoned a squad, if my opponent knew I had that secondary and I summoned that squad, if it was Spencer, they would immediately just get sprayed down. I would never
kill even 2 of them out of the squad, right?
Yeah, I would never get that against Spencer.
Well, and another interesting thing to note, this is a good thing to bring up. In Pendulum, at least, you choose your secondaries when you make your list. When you submit a list for that tournament, before you see what mission you're going against, before you see what your opponent is, you're putting those secondaries on there. And that's very important, because I know that I've been playing a 1 Warjack skirmish force recently, just kind of testing things out. If you've put Salvage on your list for this, and my 1 Warjack has actually been a Nemesis, this feels very unattainable for you.
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting to note that you in Pendulum, at least, you will be choosing these before you ever see what you're going against. And this is the one specifically I think is probably the most that cares the most about what your opponent's bringing.
Mm-hmm.
So just keep that in mind as well. I want to like this one, but just when you have 3 limiters on how you're scoring it, even though it is uncapped on how much you can score it, it just feels like all the dominoes have to fall into place to make this one feel worth.
Yeah, you basically have to build specifically, your list specifically for this, and hope that your opponent also gives you a list where you can take advantage of it, which it's not enough. And then also just the stuff that does score it it's difficult. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one.
So the next secondary mission is Recon. The first time you get a unit within 5 inches of your opponent's rear table edge, score 3 victory points. Josh, do you have any thoughts about this one?
I'm looking through Marcher World glasses, and being arguably one of the most mobile factions outside of Nemesis, that one feels attainable, but at the same time, it feels like you have to put yourself out of scenario in a sense to get there.
Yeah, on full size for sure. On Skirmish,
I was about to say, this one is very different. On Skirmish, it's very easy to get a void gate on your opponent's side of the table. And, if I move a squad onto your objective on boiling point, I can probably put one of my guys in your deployment zone, because that particular objective has 10 millimeters of the scoring zone for it inside your deployment zone anyways. At that point, I'm just for going for objectives that I'm planning on going for anyways, I have a fair chance of just scoring this.
Yeah,
well,
it's super easy to score. Fun thing, Empyreans, if you have Displacement Index in your hand, can score that turn 1, top of turn 1.
It's a little silly. I think now this is one of those that it should be noted, you only score this one time. You can only ever get 3 points from this one. Whereas on Skirmish, if you just don't think you have what it takes to get some of the other ones, this one's a pretty easy get. Like, you don't have to go super out of your way to get this one. And sometimes even putting a gate and summoning a model where the back of their base is touching your opponent's deployment zone is a really easy way to still threaten certain points and still just score this without even trying. Whereas I think on full size, this is actually mildly interesting because all of those points are at least 10 inches away, which means like you have to, like, all the objectives are 10 inches away from the back table edge at least. And so then you actually have to start thinking like, well, how can I get a gate that far back? Because you already have to slog up the board far enough to get to there.
Mm-hmm.
This one could be super interesting in full size. I think in Skirmish, it's not interesting, and it's like an auto 3 points if you ever care to go for it. But it's the final one we're going to talk about, I think, it just kind of makes it to where, why would you even go for this?
Yep. So then the next one?
The next secondary mission is called Overrun. If you end the pulse round with at least 3 more squads in play than your opponent, score 2 victory points. Sneaky, what are your thoughts on this one?
In Skirmish, please bring a list that has 4 squads against me. And in full size, it's just really hard because you're both going to be bringing a lot of squads anyways because of how the scenarios work. So it just means you have to kill a bunch of stuff anyways, which just means that the other one's probably going to be better. And it does give second player a lot of advantage because they can, arc up a Void Gate and then drop 2 squads out of it at the end of a pulse round. And then that could potentially swing it. So not a big fan.
By the way, Sneaky, they only need to bring 3 squads in Skirmish. They just have to kill your only squad you have out.
That's true. That's true. Assuming ever summon it. I don't care. Bring 3 squads.
I completely agree. One interesting thing about this one is it's in a pulse round.
Yeah.
So this one you will only ever score a maximum of 6 points on if you can meet this ridiculous requirement of having 3 extra squads over your opponent.
True. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think it ever happens, especially in Skirmish. If you're bringing 3 squads, you are putting yourself so far out of the game. Like, Skirmish is just not.
You can mitigate the output of squads, right? Like, if I kill 2 of all but one of your squad members, well, you better have a grafter, mortality index, or mortality, whatever the last.
Yeah.
Destabilizer. You need some of those cards to even get that squad back in the game, or you need to recall it. And in Skirmish, sometimes you just can't afford to recall things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if the tempo on full size allows you to, but I know in Skirmish it's very hard to find a turn where it's like, well, I can afford to recall something instead of summoning.
Yeah, unless you're already super far ahead and you just don't have anything to summon. Right. So yeah, I think this one, I think there's probably a point where it is interesting, but I think at 3 more than your opponent, it's just like, in full size, if you've got 3 more squads than your opponent, you're probably already dominating that game anyways. So I don't know. I think this one could have been cool, and it's just they put the bar so high that it's just like, well, why would I ever try for this? And after Kickstarter 2, this one also got a lot harder after the introduction of the Raker and the Airlift because they're tanky. So it's harder to clear squads than before.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So that one I think there's a threshold where it could have been interesting, but it's just too hard as it is. The 4th secondary mission they have in the book is Disrupt. Each time a unit you control causes an enemy gate to collapse, score 1 victory point. Josh, what are your thoughts?
I'm struggling with. It sounds less attainable than some of the others. The moving to the board edge sounds so easy. More so in Skirmish. It's like I'm having trouble with any of these because of the last one we're going to talk about.
Right.
My thoughts are just so jaded based on our next topic that it's hard to wrap my mind around each of these individually because I would never consider any of them. What do you think, Spence?
Fair. So for Disrupt, it's just like it sounds easy because you just have to kill 1 model and you get a victory point. But Void Gate defense 5 armor, and Void Gates are a key resource. So when you deploy them, you're doing your absolute best to make sure that they're in a position to where they're going to be safe already. It's very difficult to destroy a Void Gate in the first place, and then to destroy them consistently enough in order to make up for the only getting 1 victory point is very difficult. And the thing is if you destroy a Void Gate, then that means that the next turn your opponent's going to have to put out a 5-arc Void Gate, which just makes it even harder to get this in the future. So I'm not a fan of it. It's way harder to get than it sounds.
I also don't think running, getting 1 victory point for it's enough.
Correct.
If this was like a 3 victory point, I might consider it. And
I think if this was a 3 victory point, I think you go for this one a lot of the time.
Yeah. Whereas compared to like Recon, you just run up the board, you get 3 points, and then that's it. Like it's easy, right? Whereas having to go out of your way to destroy the Void Gates all the time in order to get the same amount of victory points it's difficult. It's very difficult.
What I think is weird about this one is it incentivizes you to play with to focus on hurting your opponent's resources rather than what they've already got out on the table. And sometimes that can even come back to bite you. If I happen to kill that 5-arc Void Gate, I'm like, I just got a victory point. And then they have their AC and they just blast me with a Fury that's now got, 5 extra arc on it. It's a real feels bad at that point. Sometimes you'll just clear all their activation tokens at some point because they didn't summon things that would have made their activation economy get more awkward. This kind of has a weird domino effect too when you go for it. I can see that if you have an army that you've built this crazy ISA force that is just null everywhere, or you've got these Ranger Fire teams and you're running 2 of them and just gates can't survive against you. I can see a world where this could be worth it, but it's just so hard normally turn to turn to get this. And compared to the last one we're going to talk about, that it's not worth it, and you're not dealing. If you're killing their gates that aren't scoring them objectives, you're probably losing on the actual mission itself.
Yeah. Plus,
and
with the introduction of
whether you win or lose, right?
Plus, with the introduction of Nyx and the Gatecrasher and Eschatonic Well, there's 2 factions that if you kill their Void Gate, they're not that upset.
Yeah, they're still getting those models out on the field, whether you killed that gate or not.
Yeah.
So it's a very awkward situation. I want to like this one because I also have mixed feelings about these secondary missions that are wanting you to do things that you want to do anyways. Taking away your opponent's gates is something you should want to do, right?
Right.
You should want to stop them from having these new units and new resources coming into the game. This one's just very hard without giving you enough for sacrificing on the mission.
Right.
And that I think is the heart of the problem, is it doesn't give enough for what you're giving up.
Right. Then let's get on to the final one, and then some final thoughts on.
So body count. Each time you destroy 3 or more of your opponent's units, so that's any unit, a whole squad, a solo, a warjack, a vehicle, any 3 of those, during a single turn, score 2 victory points with no cap on how many times you can score this. What are your thoughts, Vince? Oh, Josh is jumping in. I want to see this. Let's get
This is by far the easiest secondary objective to score. Justin and I played a game the other night, and I scored this 3 times, and I missed an attack that almost let me.
I think Josh is gone, but he missed an attack that almost let him score it another time, and
times in one turn.
Yeah, he would have scored it twice in one turn. You can't score it twice in one turn, but he would have killed 6 units in a single turn, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
Each time you destroy 3 or more of your opponent's units during a single turn, score 2 victory points. So you can score it 2 times in one turn.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on how you read it.
Well, it says each time.
It is by far the craziest one.
The problem is that this one, if you're playing the game, you're likely to score this at least once, right? Yeah. And if you have an army that really excels at killing the opponent's things, for whatever reasons, you've got sprays that just happen to keep lining up really well, or you're playing against AC and your blasts are just getting whole squads at a time. You're likely to score this, and you can score this so many times without there being a cap on how many times you score this. It makes it to where you can quickly outscore the scenario just by scoring this.
Well,
Yeah.
I also think it puts AC at an extra disadvantage because a lot of AC forces I've played against play very solo heavy, and
Right.
removing 2 Weavers and a Marauder off the board isn't exactly like a monumental feat to get you those victory points.
100%. Like,
Right.
and Weavers already have a premium on their head in this game, anyways, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Well,
and
solos in general.
Weavers more than anybody else. So,
Yeah. And the thing is you have the whole turn. That means you have both your ciphers, so 2 Furies or a Fury and Aggression Theorem. You've got both your activations. So you can do a lot. I mean, if the Siegebreaker walks up and kills one solo, you're already a third of the way there. You activate
and
your
then
jacket, it kills two
start
more
comes
solo.
up and melee
Yeah,
something down and shoot something else down. You've scored it.
yeah. Or you drop a Fighter Dustwolf anywhere where it can attack 3 things on the board.
Well, you put a Fighter Dustwolf in like a fairly safe spot next to a 5-art gate, and if they summon, they've more or less given you body count.
Right.
Well, in the game against Spencer the other night, my fighter Duskwolf killed 4 things in one round. It killed 3 things just with melee attacks and then killed the Weaver with its Blazer.
Yeah,
Right.
which is not hard for a Fighter Dustwolf to do at all.
Right. I mean, that's par for the course for the Fighter Dustwolf. So
Yeah.
this one is problematic because you can score it so many times, and it skews the game so much. Like it kind of takes away from what I was saying at the very beginning of the podcast, how this is an objective-based game. This means that you don't even have to necessarily play the objectives, you just have to kill better than your opponent.
Mm-hmm.
And you can make up that deficit of not being as good at the objectives or the scenario.
I
Yeah.
know personally in tournaments, I will never take anything but body count.
Yeah, which brings up my point on secondaries in general. Like, I know Dino's been trying to like come up with like neat and interesting secondaries, but my thoughts is that people are always going to build for what is the most optimal in a competitive environment, right? So hence the state of body count right now, where it is the simplest, most consistent thing that you can get, and it allows you to get more points than anything else in the game. So people are going to be taking body count because it's the best. It either creates like broad generalizations that are useless, like body count, where everybody's going to take it, or it's going to create secondaries that are then going to require people to restrict their play styles in order to take advantage of them, which I abhor. I don't want to have to restrict my play style because something was designed in such a way that something is better. Like, I'm not a fan of that. So what I would prefer is that Privateer Press, rather, instead of focusing on secondaries and creating balanced secondaries, focuses on building better scenarios and just do away with secondaries entirely, because they already take away from the objective-based part of the game. So I'm not a fan of them at all. I want them gone.
I think they're interesting. I think there's a way to kind of make them interesting enough that they're good and they do have an impact on the final score of the game, but to where they don't feel oppressive and they don't feel like gimmies or just win harders, right? Like body count, if you score that, Josh scored that I think 3 times in one pulse round against me.
Correct.
Because he just killed my everything, and me trying to get back on the board just gave him more to kill every turn. So like he scored it three turns in a pulse round in a row on me, and it just made it to where it was like, well, even if I made a really good scenario play, it just didn't matter. I think honestly, all of them should only score at most at the end of the pulse round. It should be some kind of collective effort that you've had to do throughout the pulse round that you keep track of, and it should show that you've done something that isn't necessarily like a gimme, right? If I'm making my own secondary, one thing I think might be interesting is, hey, you have to cast X number of Furies during the pulse round, but in order to do this, to even take the secondary, you need to have a 15-card deck. So you're not even guaranteed to get all the Furies, so it's a huge risk-reward. I think that makes it more interesting. I'm not sure if it makes it good, and that's just like my initial stab at it. I'm not a game designer by any stretch, but I do think that these secondaries in their current state are not good for the scenario packet. I think they're not good for Pendulum. I think if the other ones existed and body count was gone, I think everybody just take Recon, and then it would just be a wash anyways.
Yeah, so like that's my point, is that secondaries are either going to be generalized to the point where it doesn't matter because people are just always going to take whatever makes the most sense, is the easiest to get for the most amount of points, which is currently body count, or they're going to create weird stuff that limits your playstyle, like Salvage and Overrun. And I'm not a fan of either of those scenarios because if they're so generalized, everybody's taking the same thing, then why do they exist? And if it's limiting my playstyle, I'm not a fan. So
Yep, I agree completely. And
I,
this
I
is coming from someone that his faction gets body count without trying. So
yeah, like I don't imagine. I'd rather Privateer Press focus more on developing other things than trying to balance this secondary point of things that's going to change depending on the game size and depending on the scenarios and all of these other factors that are in the game. I would rather them just do away with it entirely, and you win by playing the scenario that you're given.
yep.
I mean, I like that too. I do think that us having secondaries this early on in the game means that it's probably something we're going to be stuck with for a long time, even though I think they are wildly unbalanced in their current state. I think that.
Well, the other cool thing is that the TO can say we're not playing secondaries. So
That's true. That's one interesting thing about Pendulum is that format is literally whatever your EO or TO says it is, which is for better or for worse, right? Because that means that you can go up to you can try and sign up for a tournament and not know what you're getting yourself into until you read that player packet. And I would suggest that anybody going to any tournament read your player packet very carefully. And that's even in games like War Machine, where the player packet is generally pretty standard.
Yeah, I think we fleshed the secondaries out pretty thoroughly. Like, I think we all stand fairly similar on them. They're cool, they add something thematic, but they either need to be fleshed out further to a point where not everyone is going to take the same one, or they need to be done away with entirely.
Right, and I think there's a world where they can be interesting and fun. I think there's a level where you can have them where they contribute to the game rather than take away from them. Other games use them, like the new 40K. It has a secondary kind of thing where you choose 3 things that you're going for during the game as well as going for the mission. And like Malifaux's always had like a main mission and you have the side missions. There are games that do it and do it successfully. I think that Warcaster doesn't have to be different in that, but I don't think that in its current iteration, it's where they want it to be, and I know it's definitely not in a good state for the game.
agreed.
Cool. So, should we round table some final thoughts here? Justin,
Sure.
let's start
You
with
want to
you.
start? Oh no, okay, I'll start. I'm super excited for the way that Warcaster plays. Being so objective and mission focused, barring the secondaries, I think it's really fun and it's really engaging. And I think that with a few tweaks to a few scenarios, like every scenario could be fun. And you wouldn't roll that dice at a tournament and or have your TO say, well, you're playing this one and have see that groan from the crowd. Privateer Press just needs to kind of hone in a little bit on certain scenarios, and it could be just a very solid packet where all of the scenarios are fun and engaging and just remove that whole second player advantage. Like, this game could be so much with just a few little tweaks to different scenarios.
What about you, Spencer?
Yeah, I agree. I love the variety of scenarios that we have, how each of them plays very different, and the fact that we've seen that Privateer Press is looking to innovate and add new and exciting things. So I'm really excited about that. And again, Warcaster is so fun. It's such a great game. It's so well designed that I think there's just like a couple little tweaks here and there that need to be made, and it's going to go from a great game to a ridiculously amazing game.
And on the note of one of those tweaks, I'm just going to leave my final thought nice, short, and sweet, and just say boo to end of pulse round scoring. And that's that. So on that note, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Essex Wargames. Now, if y'all enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe. Now, for more content, you can check out the Through the Void Gate blog, or join us on the Essex Wargames Facebook, Discord, and YouTube. Stay safe and roll super strikes.